Welcome back, V-Discovery viewers. Today I am joined by Dani Barak. It is a pleasure to have you, Dani.
Thank you.
Topic of today's conversation is downsides of email threading. Now, I know what you're thinking. Email threading, we all love it, we all use it. It's a great technology, and it is. We do recommend it to all of our clients. However, there's some downsides, or the way you put it, there's some considerations that everyone needs to be aware when using email threading. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today.
So, as we all know, email threading is starting to become pretty standard in the e-discovery world. It's a very effective way of cutting down on the amount of data to review. For those of you who are unfamiliar with email threading, it's a way of only looking at an email that includes all the emails that came before it. When you're looking at an email chain, you usually see all the emails listed, and why should you have to review every single individual message when you have one email that has a summary, basically, of everything that's in there.
Yep. And the way we look at email threading is basically new deduplication. In the past, if somebody would say, do not deduplicate my data, we would say, what's going on? What's wrong with you? Why wouldn't you want to deduplicate your data? Now we get into a point where if somebody says, do not do email threading on my data, we would be like, why not? You know, it doesn't make any sense. So let's jump into a couple of categories where email threading may be a little bit troublesome or things to be aware of. So for this video, we're going to talk about email threading downsides in two parts. First, we'll talk about where you may have difficulties in review or productions. And in part two, we talk about what kind of trouble you may have when you're receiving data that contains all-inclusive email threads. So let's start with review and production. So when you review entire email threads, you're looking at the whole communication, emails from the top to bottom. And sometimes emails in that thread could be privileged. So what you would need to do is, if you mark entire email thread as privileged, it'll be excluded from production. However, you may want to have some emails in that email thread produced. So what you would have to do is either redact privileged emails, or as another workaround, you can go back to the unthreaded version of those emails and locate those and mark them for production. Another problem you may have is when one email thread branches out into multiple threads and the last email in each one of those branches is an inclusive email. In that situation, you may have those inclusive emails coded differently. So one of the things you have to do is deal with coding conflicts between different all-inclusive emails that started from the same email branch.
One other thing that you may have to consider when you're doing email threading is to make sure that the people who are doing the email review understand the difference between reviewing for an email threaded review and reviewing a standard document by document review. One example of a problem that can come up is if your attorneys are used to just coding an email as privileged, whenever they see a privileged communication at the top of it, they may get to the end of a chain, see an email that looks like it's privileged, and then just say, okay, this is privileged. Now, normally, if you're just reviewing every single message, then it doesn't matter because the previous emails in the chain were not privileged and they were marked as responsive, and they end up getting produced. But if you're only reviewing that last document, the attorney needs to understand how a thread is going to be reviewed. And if they mark something as privileged, they need to understand that the entire thread will then become privileged because you're only reviewing inclusive emails. And in that situation, they need to be instructed how to deal with it, and instead of marking it as privileged, to actually redact the privileged area of the email and then mark it as responsive if it is.
All right, that's a very good point to clarify. Thank you, Dani. And now let's move on to if you are a receiving party of an email thread production. So some of the issues you may have there is some of the metadata may be missing. For example, when we run deduplication, file name and file date of a duplicate usually get dropped out. And no one really worries about that because it's, well, not a big deal. However, in email threading, you will have even more metadata drop out. For example, people's names. Even though the people's names will be in the email thread and you'll see them in the headers, they will not be in the metadata from to CC fields.
Right, so one of the things you can do is, in terms of the people who are dropping off there, you can actually run a script to then populate a field that contains a delimited list of all of the participants of that chat to allow that information to be sorted and filtered. But one of the issues that you might run into is something like a date range,
Yes.
where you can have an email chain that goes back and forth. If people just reply back and forth to an email chain, it could go over many months. And in that case, if you're focusing on a particular time period and you want to review just that time period, and you're produced this email chain that has a start date on it, or it has a sent date on it, but doesn't actually tell you all the dates that are in between, you now have to face this situation where you can't run the normal filtering as you would on a production that contains all the metadata for all those emails. And this becomes very difficult to manage, because now, whereas it might have been easier for the people who are producing the data to you to only review the most inclusive, now you can't do your filtering on those messages to try to find the part of the email that might be relevant, because you can't search by date. And you might end up having to review hundreds of extra pages to get to that point. And there really isn't a way to populate a field in a way that would be date searchable. You might be able to do something like have each one populated with a date start and a date end. That might help a little bit, so that you can at least do a little bit of filtering there.
The other thing to consider, if you look into graph how many emails were received by date, to see if you're missing any or if there have any gaps in communications, you will not be able to do that as well, because of, like we talked about, you don't have those dates populated in fields.
Right, so if you're used to using analytic tools that allow you to chart and graph those emails, you won't actually be able to see those effectively on a chart if you're dealing with a production of a threaded communication.
Yep.
That leaves the people who are being produced to at a disadvantage with that information, because the people who are actually doing the initial review did have access to that functionality before they actually ended up producing just the top level emails.
All right, I think that's our list. Again, just want to say that this is the list of to be aware of. This is not a reason not to use email threading. These are just things to be aware of. If you have a list of things that we didn't mention, please leave them in the comments section below. And don't forget to follow vDiscovery on social media networks listed on your screen. And for previous videos, check us out on YouTube. Thanks for watching.